3 days after Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, the President of the United States flew over New Orleans in Air Force One, and he did not land. He looked out the window at a flooded city, neighborhoods underwater, people on rooftops waving at planes, 30,000 people trapped inside a football stadium with no power, barely any food, and no plan to get them out. He looked out the window, then he flew to Washington. The same day, on a tarmac in Mobile, Alabama, President George W. Bush put his arm around the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, a man whose job it was to fix all of this, and said, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job." 50,000 more people were trapped at the New Orleans Convention Center at that exact moment. No food, no water, no security. They had been there for 2 days. The man Bush was praising had told Congress he found out about them from watching the news. The news had been covering it for 36 hours. This is Mismanaged. I'm Joseph. Every episode we look at a real organization or a company, government agency, and institution and ask the same question. What decisions did the people in charge make? Why did they make them? And what can the rest of us learn from it? No fluff, just the story, the failures, and the lessons. Today's episode is about Hurricane Katrina, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and how one of the deadliest disasters in American history was made significantly worse by the people who were supposed to stop that from happening. FEMA was created in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter. The idea was simple. Before FEMA, disaster response in the United States was scattered across dozens of federal agencies. When a hurricane hit or dam broke, the federal government's response was slow and disorganized because nobody in charge. FEMA was supposed to fix that. One agency, one mission, one point of contact for states and cities dealing with emergency. For most of its early years, FEMA was not particularly impressive. It had a reputation for being slow and disorganized. When Hurricane Hugo hit in 1989 and the Bay Area earthquake happened shortly after, FEMA's response was widely criticized as too little, too late. And in 1993, a man named James Lee Witt took over. It was different from every FEMA director before him for one reason. He actually knew what he was doing. He had run Arkansas's Emergency Management Office. He understood disasters from the ground level. He reorganized FEMA around preparation, building relationships with state and local governments before disasters rather than scrambling to find phone numbers after them. He pushed his agency to practice, drill, and think through scenarios in advance. It worked. FEMA's response to the 1994 Northridge earthquake in California and major floods throughout the late 1990s was praised across the country. Congress liked FEMA. Governors liked FEMA. Emergency managers around the world studied it as a model. By 2001, FEMA was considered one of the best-run agencies in the federal government. Then, September 11th happened. In the months that followed, the Bush administration created the Department of Homeland Security, a massive new department designed to pull together the government's various security agencies under one roof. The logic was that the September 11th attacks revealed too many agencies operating separately with no one coordinating them. Solution? Put them all together. 22 agencies were merged into DHS. FEMA was one of them. Emergency management experts warned at the time that this was a mistake. FEMA's strength came from being independent, having a direct line to the president, being focused purely on disasters, having relationships built over years with state and local governments, leading it into a department focused on terrorism would. They said, weaken all of that. Those warnings were acknowledged. They were set aside. FEMA lost its cabinet-level status. Its director no longer reported directly to the president. It became one piece of a much bigger machine whose main focus was preventing terrorist attacks, not preparing for floods and hurricanes. For the next 4 years, FEMA's budget was cut. Staff left and were not replaced. The agency that had been a national model became something smaller, slower, and less focused. Then the storm came. The main players in the story are Michael Brown, the director of FEMA, Michael Chertoff, the Secretary of Homeland Security, President George W. Bush, Governor Kathleen Blanco of Louisiana, Mayor Ray Nagin of New Orleans, and the roughly 1,800 people who died, and the hundreds of thousands more who lost everything. Hurricane Katrina was one of the most powerful hurricanes in recorded history. It struck off the Gulf Coast on August 29, 2005. The storm itself was devastating, But the flooding that followed and the federal government's failure to respond to it is what turned a natural disaster into something much worse. The storm formed on August 23rd and made landfall 6 days later. The federal response, such as it was, stumbled for nearly 2 weeks before things began to stabilize. New Orleans had been considered as a disaster waiting to happen for decades. Engineers had warned that the levees protecting the city were not strong enough to survive a major hurricane. A newspaper series in 2002 had mapped out almost exactly what a direct hit would look like. Itself had run a practice simulation in 2004 called Hurricane Pam, a fictional storm nearly identical to Katrina, identified dozens of gaps in the response plan. None of them were fixed before the real storm arrived. On August 26th, with Katrina strengthening over the Gulf of Mexico, Governor Blanco declared a state of emergency in Louisiana. On August 27th, Mayor Najin issued a voluntary evacuation order for New Orleans. On August 28th, the day before landfall, Katrina reached Category 5 strength, with winds of 175 miles per hour. Najin issued a mandatory evacuation, the first in the city's history. The National Weather Service sent out a warning that read, in part, "Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. Human suffering will be incredible by modern standards." That warning was sent August 28th. Nobody could say they weren't told. About 80% of New Orleans evacuated. People who stayed were mostly poor, elderly, or sick people without cars, without money for hotels, without anywhere to go. Mayor Najin had designated the Superdome, the city's NFL stadium, as a shelter of last resort. He told people to bring enough food and water for 3 to 5 days. The city stocked it for about 1,500 people. 30,000 people showed up. Katrina made landfall on the morning of August 29th. The storm surge, a massive wall of water pushed ahead of the storm, overwhelmed the levee system. 17th Street Canal levee didn't get overtopped. It failed structurally in multiple places because it had been built poorly and not properly maintained. The Army Corps of Engineers later accepted responsibility for the failures. Water poured into the city. By August 30th, 80% of New Orleans was underwater. Some parts of the city were under 15 feet of water. People were on rooftops, people were in attics, people were calling 911 and being told to hold. Inside the Superdome, the power failed within hours of landfall. Part of the roof tore open, the heat inside reached dangerous levels, there was not enough food or water, there was not enough security, people died inside. Separately, roughly 20,000 people gathered at the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center, looking for shelter and rescue. Nobody had directed them there. No supplies had been sent there. There was no food, no water, no security, and critically, apparently no one in FEMA knew they were there. On September 1st, Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff went on National Public Radio. The host told him about the conditions at the convention center. Chertoff said he hadn't heard about that. He would look into it. It had been on every major news channel for over a day. Meanwhile, the buses that were supposed to evacuate the Superdome didn't arrive for days. Sources sat stalled. Phone calls between local, state, and federal officials went in circles. Nobody had clear authority. Nobody was making decisions. The National Response Plan, the document that was supposed to tell everyone exactly what to do, was not being followed. On September 1st, while people were dying, Michael Brown sent an email to his press secretary asking for restaurant recommendations in Baton Rouge. Earlier that week, he had emailed an aide. "Can I quit now? Can I come home?" The aide told him no. Help did eventually arrive. By September 2nd, National Guard troops were moving into the city in force. Evacuations from the Superdome and Convention Center finally got underway. The rescue operation that followed was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people were ultimately displaced, sheltered, and relocated across the country. But the damage was done. Approximately 1,800 people had died. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people never returned to New Orleans. The city's population, which had been around 485,000 before the storm, dropped to around 230,000 in the years that followed. Michael Brown resigned on September 12th, 13 days after landfall. Bush later said, in his memoir, that the flyover, not landing in New Orleans, was one of the biggest mistakes of his presidency. So, Michael Brown resigned under pressure and briefly became a media commentator, giving interviews in which he blamed everyone above and below him in the chain of command. He has since worked as an emergency management consultant and hosted a talk radio show. He has maintained consistently that he did his job well. The record largely disagrees. Michael Chertoff served as Homeland Security Secretary until the end of the Bush administration in January 2009. Later co-founded a consulting firm focused on security and risk. He received significantly less public criticism than Brown, despite making decisions, including the delayed federal emergency declaration that were at least as consequential. President Bush saw his approval ratings drop sharply after Katrina and never fully recover. He wrote in his memoir that the storm represented one of his greatest failures. Flyover image, the photograph taken from inside Air Force One, showing Bush looking out the window at the flooded city below, became one of the most defining images of his presidency. Governor Blanco did not run for re-election in 2007, citing the toll the storm and its aftermath had taken. He died in 2019. Gary Nagin was re-elected in 2006, then later convicted on 20 counts of bribery, money laundering, and fraud related to post-Katrina rebuilding contracts. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison in 2014, and he was released 5 years later in 2019. FEMA was restructured in 2006 by the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. The agency regained some independence, received more funding, and was required to be led by someone with actual emergency management experience. Its responses to subsequent disasters, including Superstorm Sandy in 2012, were notably more effective. Hurricane Katrina was not the problem. Hurricanes happen. Katrina was powerful, but it was not unpredictable. The storm's path, its strength, and the specific danger it posed to New Orleans was well understood days before it made landfall. The problem was the response. FEMA had been weakened on purpose, moved inside a larger department, had its budget cut, lost experienced staff, and was placed under a director with no relevant qualification. The plan that existed for exactly this type of disaster had never been properly tested or maintained. When the storm hit and things started going wrong, the people in charge didn't have the skills, the resources, or the clear authority to fix them fast enough. About 1,800 people died who might not have died with a faster, better organized response. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes, their neighborhoods, and their communities, and many never came back. The story of Katrina is not really about a storm. It's about what happens when the people responsible for preparing for a known, predictable type of crisis are not qualified, not resourced, and not held accountable until after the bodies are counted. So let's look at some key failures here. So failure number 1, they dismantled what was working. For 2003, FEMA was one of the most effective agencies in the federal government. It had taken years and strong leadership to get there. When the decision was made to fold it into DHS, the people who made that decision did not carefully map out what would be lost. The informal networks, the direct presidential access, the agency's singular focus on disasters, all of it degraded. They broke a working system to build a tidier organizational chart. Failure 2. They put the wrong person in charge. Michael Brown had no emergency management experience. His only related job, running a horse association, had ended with his forced resignation. He was appointed because of a personal connection to his predecessor. This was known. It didn't matter. When you hire for relationships instead of skills in a role where lives are on the line, the outcome is predictable. Failure 3. Their plan existed only on paper. FEMA had a national response plan. They had run a practice simulation the year before that showed exactly where the gaps were. But the gaps were never fixed. When the real event hit, the plan fell apart immediately because it had never been made to actually work. It had only been written down. A plan that has never been tested is not a plan. It's just a guess. Failure 4. Nobody made the call. The federal emergency declaration that would have unlocked resources and triggered the full response plan was delayed until after the storm had already made landfall. That declaration was Chertoff's responsibility, and he waited. The time between when that declaration should have been made and when it actually was, people were already dying. Clear decision-making authority, knowing who has the power to act, and making sure they use it is not a formality. It is the difference between a response and a delay. Katrina killed about 1,800 people and displaced hundreds of thousands more. The storm was the trigger. The response made it worse. The agency that had been deliberately weakened, placed under unqualified leadership, stripped of the resources and independence it needed to do its job. The people most responsible for those decisions faced limited consequences. People who paid the highest price were the residents of New Orleans, who had nowhere to go and no one coming to help them fast enough. What are some lessons that we can take away from this situation? The first one is test your plans before you need them and fix what you find. FEMA ran Hurricane Pam in 2004, found dozens of gaps, and nothing was fixed. A year later, those exact gaps showed up in the real event. Most managers have plans that have never been tested. Evacuation plans, backup vendors, emergency contacts, escalation procedures exist in a document somewhere, but if nobody has ever walked through them under realistic conditions, you don't know if they actually work. The fix is simple but uncomfortable. Run drills, do tabletop exercises, ask your team out loud, what would we actually do if this happened tomorrow? You will find things that don't work. Test them before the real event, not after. Lesson 2. Reposition your resources before you need them, not after. FEMA's pre-positioning request went out less than 24 hours before landfall. For a storm that had been tracked for a week, it was far too late. Principle in emergency management is clear. If you can see a problem coming, move your resources toward it now. This applies directly to anyone. If you know a product launch is 3 weeks away, your support team should be trained and ready today, at the day after launch when the complaints come in. If a key employee is leaving, the knowledge transfer should start now, not on their last day. If a big project milestone is coming, risks should be escalated today, not when the deadline is missed. The right time to prepare is always earlier than it feels necessary. By the time it feels urgent, you're already behind. Lesson 3. Hire for the role, not the relationship. Michael Brown was not qualified. This was known. It was set aside, and when the moment came that required everything the role demanded, he was not able to deliver it. Head hires in critical roles don't always show up immediately. Things can go fine for months or years, but the gap between what the role requires and what the person can deliver doesn't go away. It just waits for the right pressure to expose it. For any manager involved in hiring, be honest about what a role actually requires, especially in positions where failure has serious consequences. Relationships and likability matter, but they are not substitutes for capability. Time to care about qualifications is before the hire. After the failure is too late to matter to the people who got hurt. As a side note to this too, when hiring somebody, it is the manager's responsibility to ensure that the hire can be successful in their position. So putting an individual who can't be successful in their position because you don't want to make them feel bad and deny them from that position, just setting everybody up for failure rather than actually being able to lead the team in a successful manner. Then lesson 4, when you reorganize, name what you're breaking, not just what you're building. The decision to put FEMA inside DHS solved the real problem. The federal government's security and emergency functions were fragmented and needed better coordination. The reorganization made sense on paper. What it didn't account for was what FEMA had built over years that couldn't be shown on an org chart. The relationships with state and local officials, the focused culture, the direct line to the White House, the institutional knowledge about how to actually run a disaster response. When FEMA got folded in, those things didn't transfer. They dissolved. Every reorganization builds something new and breaks something that existed. What gets broken is usually the informal stuff, the relationships, the habits, the unwritten knowledge that nobody documented because nobody thought to. Before you reorganize a team, a department, or a process, ask this question directly. What currently works that this change could break? Then get a real answer. If you can't explain how those things survive the transition, you don't yet understand what you're about to do. So there's a version of the Katrina story where none of this happens. It doesn't require anything extraordinary. It requires a qualified FEMA director. It requires keeping the agency independent enough to do its job. It requires fixing the gaps that the Hurricane Pam exercise found. It requires making the federal emergency declaration before the storm hits, not after. None of those things are heroic. They're just competent. They're the kind of work that happens quietly before the crisis that nobody writes news stories about because nothing went wrong. Competence is boring. Preparation is boring. Testing your plans and fixing the gaps is boring, but about 1,800 people died in the Gulf Coast region after Hurricane Katrina. A large portion of those deaths were not caused by the storm. They were caused by the absence of boring, unglamorous preparation work that should have been done long before August 29th, 2005. It's not that disasters are preventable. It's that the gap between a bad outcome and a catastrophic one is almost always filled or not filled by decisions made long before anyone is paying attention. Thank you for listening to Mismanaged.